Now, there are four plays in this year's Bard season, as usual. Three of them are by Shakespeare. One is about Shakespeare. And thinking about these four plays, I think that there is a thread that connects them all together. And that thread is the question of identity. In all of these plays, you have characters taking on disguises or taking on new roles or being defined by other people, sometimes by choice, sometimes by compulsion. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's disastrous. But all of these plays ask the question, who am I, at a very deep level? And we'll start by thinking about that in terms of Taming of the Shrew. Oh dear, Taming of the Shrew. This play was popular in its time. We know that because there were plays written in response to it. John Fletcher, a playwright with whom Shakespeare worked, wrote a play called The Tamer Tamed. Okay. So it was popular. But since at least 1970, this play has been politically fraught. We have a story of a woman who is just denied food, denied sleep, denied to acknowledge her own reality, and then has to, at length, expound about how women should be subservient to their husbands. Politically fraught. In the past 3 years, with the advent of the #MeToo movement, which has recognized the abusive behavior of men in a variety of fields, it has gone from being fraught to explosive. How do you deal with this play in this day and age? It is a challenge, and the director, Lois Anderson, of this production comes up with some interesting choices, and we'll have to talk about whether we agree with those choices. But first of all, I want to summarize the play. The play has 3 storylines. You're only going to see 2 of them in this production. One of them is cut, but I want to talk about it anyway. It's the first one. It's the play's induction. This play has a framing device, a dramatic sort of introduction, and it's the story of Christopher Sly. Christopher Sly is an Englishman and a drunkard. He comes on stage after being just thrown out of a tavern, and after a few minutes of railing, he passes out unconscious on the ground. A nobleman, just come from hunting, passes by, sees this drunkard there, and then, I don't know how bored this nobleman is. He gets an idea. He says, what if we take said drunken beggar back to my place, dress him in my clothes, have all my servants address him as Lord, get a young boy to dress as his wife, and then tell him when he wakes up that, of course you are Lord, but you've been mad for 15 years. You've been out of your brain. Thank God you've returned to sanity. Wouldn't this man believe that he is a Lord? And so that's what they do to him. They dress him up, they talk to him like he's a Lord, they tell him he's been brain sick, and of course, at first he doesn't believe it. But after a while, he begins to question his reality. And he begins to ask that question, who am I? Am I a Lord? And have I such a lady? Or do I dream? Or have I dreamed till now? I do not sleep. I see, I hear, I speak, I smell sweet savors and feel soft things. Upon my life, I am a Lord indeed, and not a tinker, not Christopher Sly. And then, of course, he wants to go to bed with the woman. And they say, no, it's bad for your health. Instead, we're going to show you a play. It's called Taming of the Shrew. And so we get this induction. The play is framed by someone watching it. We only come back to Sly briefly a little later where he's falling asleep during the production. And it has to be, no, wake up, Lord, wake up. And he's not at the end of the play. And a lot of critics have thought about this. Why don't we come back to Sly at the end of the play? What happens? Is this a mistake in Shakespeare's part? We don't know, but I'll tell you about some of the sources later that might help us understand that. So that's story number 1, a framing device about the malleability of identity. Story number 2, we will call it The Seduction of Bianca. In the play, we are in Padua, Italy. A rich man by the name of Baptista Manola has 2 daughters, Catherine, the older daughter, and Bianca, the younger daughter. Bianca is beautiful. She is sweet. She is the love of the town. She has suitors for her hand, 2 of them in particular. A man called Gremio, who's old. He is a comic character which you find in a lot of Italian drama called the Pantaloon. And the Pantaloon is usually an old man who doesn't realize he's old and sets his sight on a younger woman, right? Inappropriately. It may remind us of some political figures south of the border. And then there's a younger man, Hortensio. So they are rivals for Bianca's hand. But the play actually begins with the arrival in town of a man called Lucentio. Lucentio arrives with his servants, Tranio and Biondello, and Lucentio has come to Padua to study. He's going to dedicate himself to a life of the mind. It's about philosophy. Now, in Shakespeare, whenever a young man says, I'm going to lead a life of the mind, doesn't work out. For Lucentio, it lasts almost exactly 20 lines because he sees Bianca, and that's it. Boom. Okay, he's overwhelmed. And he decides what he's going to do to get to Bianca. He comes up with a plan. Because she's an Italian lady, she's protected in her household. I'll disguise myself as a literature teacher and become one of her tutors. Her father's hiring tutors for his daughters, so I'll become a tutor for Bianca, and that's what he does. Problem, though, he is supposed to be keeping a household in Padua. His father or whatever has sent him here to do that. Someone's got to maintain the household. So his servant Tranio says, that's okay, I'll play you and run the household, you play the literature teacher, and you try to seduce Bianca. Meanwhile, Hortensio, one of the original suitors, also comes up with the same idea. Hey, I'll disguise myself as a music teacher and get in with Bianca. So think about this. We're not even out of the first act of the play yet, and we've got 3 people in disguise. Big part of the population of this play goes through most of the play pretending to be someone else. So, it all gets to work, and Tranio, meanwhile, pretending to be Lucentio for reasons that are not entirely clear, goes to Baptista, the daughter of Bianca, and says, hey, I'm Lucentio, I'm interested in your daughter too, and I'm incredibly wealthy. So wealthy that I think she should live with me. And Baptista actually agrees on the condition that his father sort of signs off on the deal. So now Tranio has to find a father. A merchant passing through town, they trick him and get him to play the father. So now we have 4 people in disguise. Hortensio realizes that Bianca has eyes for the literature teacher, the literature professor, and who can blame her? So he drops the costume, he drops the chase, and he goes off and marries a widow. Meanwhile, Tranio's arranging things. We've got this fake father in the figure. While this stuff is going on, things are being negotiated. Bianca and Lucentio elope. Now that's a bit of a surprise, because at the beginning of the play, we're told that Bianca is the good daughter. She's the obedient daughter. She's the sweet daughter. But she's the one who runs away with this man. She's the one who elopes. Suddenly, this is all happening, what should show up, or who should show up, but Lucentio's real father comes to town and is baffled by all these people wearing these various disguises, and you have this explosion of comic confusion, out of which it emerges that Bianca has married Lucentio, but the father of Lucentio says it's okay, the wealth will be fine, and everyone's happy. And that's the story of Bianca. The third storyline is the famous one, the one after which the play is named. It's the story of a man called Petruchio, who arrives in Verona because his father has died, and he says, I want to see the world. He's an odd guy. He says, I want to see the world and marry, but he goes on and on about how his wife has to be rich. But he tells us he has crowns in his purse and goods at home. We later find out he has 6 servants in his household and 1 traveling with him. How much money does this guy need? He also is something of a braggart. He has this speech where he talks about his sort of experiences in the world. Sorry if I can just find it here. What's the word? Sorry. There we go. He says, they tell him there's this woman you might want to marry, but she's a bit loud. And he says, think you a little din can daunt mine ears? Have I not in my time heard lions roar? Have I not heard the sea puffed up with wind's rage like an angry boar chafed with sweat? Have I not heard great ordnance in the field and heaven's artillery thunder in the skies? Have I not in a pitched battle heard loud larums neighing steeds and trumpets clang? And do you tell me of a woman's tongue? I don't think you've heard any of those things. Your father's just died and you've told us you're going to finally see the world. If you'd been a soldier and seen lions, you've seen the world. So a bit of a strange guy. But he finds out about Kate from his friend Hortensio. And Hortensio is eager for Catherine to get married, because the father of Catherine and Bianca has said, Bianca can't marry until Catherine, the elder daughter, is married. So there's money, there's going to be a dowry, but also Hortensio and Gremio will give extra money to whoever can marry Catherine, because then they have a shot at Bianca. So double money if you marry Catherine. So Petruchio says, yes, I'm going to do this. Now, what about Catherine? Catherine, in our age, we would say she has anger management issues. She is furiously angry at everything. She is angry at her father. She is angry at her sister. She hits people. She's physically violent. She beats up her sister. The first time she meets Petruchio, she hits him. She hits servants. She's just this explosion walking around. But Petruchio is not scared off by this. He says, I'm going to take up the challenge. And before he meets Catherine, he meets the father, Baptiste, and says, hey, I'd like to marry your daughter. And Baptiste says, yes, thank God. Yes. As long as you can get her love. And Petruchio says, not a problem. Incredibly confident. Then, before he meets her, he tells us, the audience, how he's going to do this, how he's going to tame this woman who's got this terrible, terrible reputation in the city of Padua. Here it is. So he tells us his plan. Say that she rail, that is, shout and carry on. Why, then I'll tell her plain she sings as sweetly as a nightingale. Say that she frown. I'll say she looks as clear as morning roses newly washed with dew. Say she be mute and will not speak a word. I'll commend her volubility and say she uttereth piercing eloquence. If she do bid me pack, I'll give her thanks, as though she bid me stay for a week. If she deny to wed, I'll crave the day. So he sets about to contradict her in everything she's going to do. He's going to basically deny her reality. And he does this as soon as she comes on stage in their first meeting. Sorry, gotta find it here. He comes on stage. She comes on stage angry, of course. She's been sent there by her father. And here she comes, and he says, "Good morrow, Kate, for that's your name, I hear." Catherine responds, "Well have you heard, but something hard of hearing. They call me Catherine, that do talk of me." You lie in faith, for you are called plain Kate, and bonny Kate, and sometimes Kate the Cursed, but Kate, the prettiest Kate in Christendom, Kate of Kate Hall and super dainty Kate. So you see what he's doing there. The first thing he's doing is denying her identity. That's not your name anymore. That's not who you are. I'm defining who you are. I'm renaming you. We're starting from scratch. So, he begins this process. He then tells the father and everyone around, you know, when we're alone, she loves me. She is the sweetest girl in the world. But when you are around, it's sort of a fun thing. She keeps pretending to be really angry about everything. It's a hoot. It's a hoot, right? And this traps her, in a sense. And then he says, okay, she's trapped. Okay, next week we're getting married. What? And yet, she shows up for the marriage, right? So there's something in Catherine, or Kate, that wants to get married, that wants to get out of the Baptista household. But the wedding doesn't go the way she planned. Bridezilla, you ever seen those shows? She would like to be that, but what happens is Petruchio shows up late for the wedding, leaves her standing at the altar, shows up dressed in a ridiculous outfit. We don't see the wedding ceremony itself. Marriage is a sacrament. You couldn't show it on the Elizabethan stage. So it's off stage, but we're told about it, how at one point he hits the priest. It's a disaster. And then afterwards, he says, well, we can't stay for the reception. We got to go now. Catherine says, I don't want to. He says, I don't care. We're going. And he drags her away. And then begins the taming. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in the taming. But basically, for the next few days, he denies her sleep. He denies her food. And denies reality. She says something's white. He says it's black. Eventually, she capitulates. She goes along with him. And the big question and how you play it, is it out of exhaustion? Is she been so worn down? Or is she somehow in on the game? I saw a production of this play at the Globe Theatre, I think it was 3 years ago, which was very, very dark. It was a play about domestic abuse. There wasn't a laugh in it. Right? That's not normally how it's played. So, at the end of this process, the play, and the play itself ends with a party at Baptista's house. We have 3 newlywed couples. We have Hortensio and the widow, we have Lucentio and Bianca, and we have Petruchio and Kate. The men place a bet on whose wife is most obedient. The wives are in another room. They send for their wives. 2 of the wives don't come. But when Petruchio sends for Kate, she comes. And then he tells her to explain to the other women their duty to their husbands. And she delivers a 43-line long speech on how women should appreciate, love, and support and be subservient to their husbands. And the play ends. You see the problem. You see how politically fraught it is. It's also a weird play structurally. I've talked in the past about the typical model for comedy that Shakespeare inherited from Latin drama, where you have a young couple that wants to get married and some authority figure gets in the way, so they have to trick him or her, and usually with the help of a servant, get married. Well, we have that in this play, the story of Bianca, right? We have Lucentio going in disguise. They sneak around behind Baptista's back. Tranio helps, and then they get married and everything's fine. But that's the subplot. The main story is entirely different. The authority figure, Baptista, not only wants his daughter to get married, he'll pay someone to marry her. Just take her, please. Right? And there's no real wooing. They meet and say, we're getting married next week. Part of this might come from the sources. The source for the Christopher Sly story is a very old one. In folklore, it's called The Beggar Transformed. And it goes back to the Arabian Nights. stories of poor people who have been woken up and tricked into believing they're rich. And that story was available in English in a variety of sources in the 16th century. Shakespeare could have got it from anywhere. The story of Bianca comes from the Italian, from an Italian writer called Ariosto, who was translated by a man called Gascoigne into a book called Supposes. And Shakespeare takes a lot from that, including the name Petruchio. But the main source, maybe, and this is really confusing, is another play. Now, this play was only published after Shakespeare died in print, 1623, in the First Folio, that collection of works that his friends put together after his death. But there's another play called The Taming of Shrew, which was printed in 1596, anonymous author. It has an induction with Sly and a conclusion with Sly. Sly comes back at the end of that play, transformed back into a tinker, and says, I've had this great theme. I know now how to tame a shrew. I dreamt upon it all this night till now, and thou hast waked me out of my best dream. And ever had I in my life, but I'll to my wife presently and tame her too. The rest of the play is basically a taming of the shrew, but not quite. It's much shorter, it's much cruder. And we have no idea what the relationship between a shrew and the shrew is. Critics have been trying to figure it out literally for centuries. Was this an early draft by Shakespeare? Was it a play Shakespeare ripped off and rewrote? Was it a memorial reconstruction of the shrew by some actors who had performed in the play and got parts of it wrong? We have no idea. But that may, in part, explain some of the confusion of the play. There was some weird transmission of texts, shrew texts, in this period. There's another source for this play, and that is shrew literature in general. There are all sorts of folk stories about shrew taming. In fact, there is, from the 16th century, a ballad, a song about shrew taming. It's called A Merry Jest of a Shrewd and Cursed Woman, Wife, Lapped in a Moral Skin for Her Good Behavior. What the heck? Moral is the name of a horse. The song goes like this. A shrewish mother raises a shrewish daughter. Shrewish daughter gets married. On their honeymoon, in their nuptial bed, she and her husband get into a physical fight. Afterwards, the shrewish wife is horrible, so finally, the husband beats her with rods until she's bloody, then sews her into the skin of his dead horse, Moral, leaving her there until she promises to be good, which she does. It's so romantic. Now, a merry jest, right? As you can tell, this literature is a little bit sexist. And the 16th century, despite having a queen on the throne, was a period of profound sexism. And the sexism came, or was justified, by several things. The first was, of course, religion. May I quote the scriptures? From Genesis. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. With sorrow shalt thou bear thy children, and thy will shall be subject to thy man, and he shall bear dominion over thee. New Testament. This is from Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. Man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. And man was not created for the cause of the woman, but the woman for the cause of the man, and therefore ought the woman to have a power upon her head. And various social and political thinkers interpreted this to prove that God meant for women to be subservient. And if that were not enough, the sexists had science on their hand. So in this period, and I've talked about this before, people believed that our health and disposition, our psychology, was largely controlled by 4 liquids that circulated in our bodies, called the humors. blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And you wanted these in balance, or else you could become sick or psychologically unbalanced. And you needed a certain amount of heat to keep those fluids circulating to keep you healthy. It had been proven, scientifically obviously, that women were naturally colder than men, and so their humors didn't circulate as well. As one scientist said, "It is the heat which makes a man bold and hardy, and the coldness of woman makes her morally fearful and timorous. And since women are weak physically, they must be weak morally and mentally." Science. And these beliefs were articulated in law. A married woman, was the possession of her husband. And just after the marriage ceremony, immediately after the marriage ceremony, Petruchio makes this perfectly clear. They've just been married. And he says of her, "I will be the master of what is mine own. She is my goods, my chattels. She is my house, my household stuff, my field, my barn, my horse, my ox, my ass, my anything. And here she stands." And under law, women had almost no rights. And something interesting, which I just discovered recently, if a man killed his wife, he would be charged with murder. If a woman killed her husband, she would be charged with murder, but also treason, because she has killed her lord. So women were relegated down. They were pushed down in this society. And so we get this shrewish stuff. Let's now turn to the taming. What is Petruchio's sort of strategy for changing Catherine? Part of it has to do with humors. You have these humors in your body. To control them and keep them healthy, you have to do a variety of things. And one of the things you have to do is eat the right foods. So by starving Kate, by not giving her food for a while, what he's doing is essentially purging her. He says this. They bring out some meat, servants, and he throws it away. He says, "It's burnt." And she says, "It's fine." He says, no. He says, I am expressly forbid to touch it, for it engenders choler, right? Planteth anger, and better 'twere that both of us did fast, since of ourselves are choleric, than feed it with such over-roasted flesh. Right? So you don't eat certain foods because they'll make you more choleric. Later, she's starving. She goes to Grumio, Petruchio's servant, says, "Is there any food around?" And Grumio says, "What do you say to a neat's foot, which is a calf's foot?" And she says, "Oh, that's great. I want it. He says, "No, I fear it is too choleric a meat, so it'll upset this humor in you, choleric meat. What about tripe? Oh, I like it. No, I fear 'tis choleric." Okay, how about beef and mustard? Ah, yes, right? No, mustard is too hot. Right? So it's all about balancing the humors in the body. So when you're watching the play, look for that language about the humors of the body and heat in the body. So it's almost medicinal what he's doing to her, starving her first and changing her diet. The second thing he does to her, to tame her, is based on falconry and hawking. At a number of points in the play, you'll hear the words kite and haggard. And both of these refer to either a falcon or a hawk. All right, hang on, let's see if I can just quickly find that for you. Yes, okay. Petruchio says this to us, the audience. "Thus have I politically begun my reign, and 'tis my hope to end successfully. My falcon now is sharp and passing empty. Until she stoop, she must not be full gorged, for then she ne'er looks upon her lure. Another way I have to man my haggard, to make her come and know her keeper's call." So falcon, haggard, birds of prey. So hawking and using falcons for hunting was a popular sport in this period. Apparently, if you're going to train a falcon or a hawk, what you have to do is stay awake with it. It has to be sitting on your arm on that leather thingy, and you have to sit there, even if it takes days, until it falls asleep on your arm. And then when it wakes up, it realizes, oh, this is my reality, right? I'm stuck with this guy. And you have to be careful how much you feed it because you want to, of course, chase your lure, right? The bait that you put out. So what he's doing is he's treating her like a hawk, treating her like a hunting bird. And again, watch for those words in the play. The last thing he's doing to, quote unquote, tame her is show her what her behavior is like. He berates and beats his servants. He chases a tailor from the room. He does all these terrible things in front of her. So it's perfectly clear, at least to his servants, by this reckoning, he is more shrew than she. So he sets an example, right, by his behavior. And those three things, quote unquote, change her. But what about for us? Can we accept this? Can we accept the woman being, quote unquote, tamed and changed? How do you deal with this? How do you deal with the sexism? Well, one of the ways has been to take this play and put it in a different setting. You're going to see it in a Western setting. Historically, that's one of the most popular settings for this play in the 20th century. There is a silent movie from 1911 called The Cowboy and the Shrew, based on this. Why cowboy stuff? I think it's because it's a time of independent machismo. I mean, in the Western world, men were men, and women were men too. So that's one way to deal with the sexism of this play. Another way, which Lois Anderson does production, is actually change some of the speeches. She gives some of Petruccio's lines to Kate and makes the characters much more balanced and almost cooperative in the outcome of the play. Now, is that the right thing to do? Are we purists? I don't know. But remember at the beginning I said that these plays tend to ask the question, who am I? Well, when we interpret Shakespeare, when we make it fit our society, the first thing we have to ask is, who are we? What do we want to see? What lessons do we want to take from this play? Thank you. So I've left about 10 minutes for questions. We're going to stop at 5 to 12. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions. And Mary is going to come around from a microphone because we want to hear you on the videotape. No, yeah, please use that.
Okay, so I know almost nothing about Shakespeare.
Okay.
So when you change the venue like this, why do the names sort of not change? Why is it still Padua? Why is it still, names from Italy as opposed to going to Tucson or something, something like that?
Well, in some productions, they do change the names. So some of you would have seen the As You Like It from last year that was set in BC, and they threw in places like Kitsilano and Okanagan. Yes, here we are in the Okanagan instead of the Forest of Arden, because they almost scan the same. Forest of Arden, Okanagan, right? They almost fit.
That's why we added the vast Okanagan.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. So it's entirely up to the director, the choice that they make. Other questions? Yeah, down the front.
What's the book that you're using?
Which book? Oh, this is just an edition. This is the latest edition of the Arden Shakespeare. It's a scholarly edition of Shakespeare. This is, I think, the third edition that comes out. I like them because they have a lot of supplemental material. Like it has the entire play, The Taming of Shrew, is in the appendix. So it's very useful, one sort of volume version play. Yeah, up there. Mary's getting her cardio in.
I'd be interested in your reflection on a comment by Bloom, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. Which was written quite a few years ago.
Yes, a long time ago.
A long time ago. And he sees Kate's speech at the end as ironic, that she is advising women how they can rule absolutely by feigning obedience.
Yeah, this in case you can hear that, the last speech is ironic. I would say the most popular way of doing this play in the at least second half of the 20th century is this. somewhere in that sort of taming sequence, usually when Petruchio says, oh, that's the sun. No, it's the moon. No, it's the sun. There's a moment where Kate gets it and then sort of plays along. It's like, oh, it's a little game we're doing. I get it, right? And so when you get to that final speech, there's also a little bit of a wink, right, to the audience. And I think I've seen this play performed that way more than any other way. But I don't see that in the text. I think that may be a modern projection of that. I think, and I've, like I said, I've seen this play done perfectly straight, and it doesn't work for our tastes and our political sensibilities, but it does work as a piece with the rest of the play. So I'm not sure Mr. Bloom is entirely right.
So I hadn't even realized that Sly was part of this play.
Yeah.
I don't think any production I've ever seen has included him. And the question I have is, any theory as to why he just sort of disappears? I mean, is it an incomplete play?
Well, this is the big question. This may have something to do with the relationship between that other play, the Shrew and this Shrew, and the Shrew, about which we still have not been able to figure out, about which critics cannot agree. I have seen it done with the introduction, and if you want to see it done with the introduction, and you have iTunes, you can rent the 2016 version of this play that was done at Stratford, Ontario, starring Ben Carlson, who has played on this stage, and his wife, Deborah Hay, who plays Kate. And they begin with a version of the introduction where a drunken audience member starts disrupting the production until he gets knocked out by an usher. And then they wake him up. But he's not at the end of the play. I've also seen it done straight, Shakespeare's text, and then at the end of the play, after the crowd at the party sort of disperses, there's this guy drunk on the floor who gets up and just scratches his head and looks around and walks off. I would be interested in seeing it done with the Shrew ending, where he gets up and says, hey, I'm going to go home and tame my wife, especially if we had a very fierce wife waiting for him just off stage. Someone else had their hand up over there.
Picking up on an earlier comment about
Yes.
resetting the play and remaking it, do you have any comments on the validity of the kind of radical change that Lois made?
Okay. Now, first of all, I'm not a purist about Shakespeare's plays, and I've said this too many times that I'm going to eventually have it made up into a T-shirt. But what I always say is when people say, what about these modern dress productions? And I say, look, if we just do straight Renaissance productions and then Shakespeare becomes a museum piece, and things in museums are dead. That's the T-shirt, okay? So I think experiment all you want. You're not going to break Shakespeare. He's still here between the pages, right? We can always go back to him. Now, the question of the rewriting, this is a bit more radical, and I've been struggling with it a bit. And I have two thoughts. Virtually every production of The Merchant of Venice that I've seen in the past years concludes with some sort of scene of Shylock being forced into a conversion, Christian conversion, right? And sometimes very drawn out and dramatic, because we have made Shylock sort of the tragic center of that play, and almost certainly he wasn't when that play first came out. So we've sort of imposed our vision, our societal norms on that play. So why not do it with this play too? On the other hand, we look back at past centuries when they took Shakespeare and rewrote him wholesale, and we say, what are you doing? So are we doing what they did in the 18th century, or are we making Shakespeare sensible to us now? Again, my final question, who are we? What do we want to get from Shakespeare? I'm still debating this, and I hope that is something that will come up at the forum. There's a forum called Kate Victim.
Victim or victor?
Right, and I will be in that forum with Lois and Jennifer Lyons, who plays Kate, and it'll be moderated by my friend from UBC, Patricia Badier, a very brilliant scholar. So that's one of the issues I hope we wrestle with specifically with Lois there on that night. Yeah. Other questions? We've got about 4 or 5 more minutes. Yeah. Hi.
Weirdly, Isaac Asimov on Shakespeare suggested that, Kate, early on in the play, she's complaining that Bianca is
she's what?
Catherine complains that Bianca is Daddy's favorite, and she's going to lead apes in hell because she'll be a spinster.
Yeah.
She wants love,
Yes.
but doesn't have any idea how to get it.
Yeah.
You know, she's just been downtrodden. And so she's so surprised when Petruchio starts saying loving things to her. She rejects them because that's what she's always done, no matter what anybody says to her. But the suggestion is that the reason that Petruchio goes through this whole black is white and light is day and is to get her to accede to what he says. And so when she finally says, okay, I agree with whatever you say, then she is open to accepting the fact that maybe he loves her.
Yes. Okay. Well done. That's an A. Okay. That was the wrong answer. Very well. Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering, all the character, what was I going to say? I can't remember. All the character changes and all the character dressing up and things like that. Was it more of a political statement back in the day because the Queen was on the throne?
So dressing up, how is dressing up a political statement?
Pretending to be men, pretending to be women, pretending to be servants, pretending to be lords. Was it sort of kind of like a political statement in his plays because he knew the Queen was watching and she had to be all those things?
Queen Elizabeth saw a lot of Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare performed at court a lot, and more starting in 1603 when King James I came to the throne, because his company became the King's Men, so they were on call all the time to play at court. I think that's a little bit of a reach, though. Clothing was political. There was something called the sumptuary laws in place, which basically dictated what you could wear depending on your social class. I don't care how much money you have. If you weren't a certain social class, you weren't allowed to wear certain fabrics and certain colors, right? And because of that, as soon as someone you met in the street or you saw on stage, you would look at that outfit and immediately know their social class, like boom, like that, in a way we don't now. I mean, especially in Vancouver, where, formal wear is black sweatpants, all right? So yes, so something like Tranio dressing up as Lucentio in a way is transgressive. But there is a long tradition of disguise in drama, almost always, not always, but almost always for comic effect. So I think it has to do more with that. And the fact of the boys dressing as women, well, that was law too. Women weren't allowed to display themselves on stage because any woman who would display herself on stage for money, well, we know what she is. All right. And that would not change until 1660. So maybe one more question. Yep. Oh, all the way up. Run, Mary, run!
Thank you. Very, very quick question.
Yes, of course.
You mentioned that around the 70s, the transition of the play to a more feminist ending occurred. Could we credit Franco Zeffirelli's version?
Production.
Taming Shrew?
So the question, the sort of change in approaches to this play in the 1970s, could we attribute to Zeffirelli? I don't think so. What we have, of course, in the 70s is sort of the beginning of the second wave of feminism, and it shows up in literary criticism. And you start to get the first really serious and some wonderful feminist critiques of Shakespeare. And this trickles up or down, however you want to think about it, into theatrical productions because, of course, it becomes a buzzword in society. And so increasingly people look at this and say, wait a minute, right? We're not just pretty young girls being amusing. These are substantive characters that have internal lives, and we have to treat them as human beings. And that means examining a lot of what's going on in these plays. So it was feminism and a wave of criticism that began and continues to this day in the 1970s. So I'm going to hang around. I just have to get this mic off, and I'll meet you. Anyone who wants more questions, I'll meet you out in the village. But again, thank you so much for coming out today. Thank you.